Despite the imposition of numerous sanctions and 2 years into the Russia-Ukraine war, a number of nations continue to maintain their connections with Moscow in order to take advantage of the cheap oil and gas that Moscow provides. In order to fulfill demand, the US, Europe, and a number of other nations reduced their reliance on Russian energy supplies when Russia invaded Ukraine. They did this by creating alternative supply chains and expanding the production of oil and gas from other sources. As soon as they achieved this goal, they started imposing sanctions on Russian energy with the intention of hurting the country's economy and stopping its military endeavors. Nonetheless, several nations have seized the opportunity to import inexpensive gas and oil from Moscow in order to increase supply and strengthen their economies. Over the course of the last 2 years, Russian energy export profits, which include those from coal, oil, and gas, have drastically decreased. From a 14-day rolling average of $65 million in March 2022 to less than $36 million in July 2023, these revenues have declined sharply. This is mostly because many powerful nations have shifted away from Russian energy products. The average earnings from Russian exports to the European Union during a 14-day period decreased from $826 million in March 2022 to $75 million in February 2024. However, from $50 million in March 2022 to $0 in February 2024, U.S. imports have decreased. This demonstrates a resolute commitment to upholding the restrictions that have been in place against Russian energy for the past 2 years. Certain nations have shifted their reliance from Russian energy, but others have augmented their imports. India's imports have gone from $5.7 million to $135 million over the course of the last 14 days, while China's increased from $171 million in March 2022 to $267 million in February 2024. China and India have surpassed the EU to become Russia's top energy importers in the past 2 years. The two Asian nations import most of their oil, then gas and coal. In order to catch up with the EU, Turkey has significantly expanded its imports of Russian energy. India plans to keep purchasing Russian energy goods as long as the price is reasonable, according to statements made by Prime Minister Modi on multiple occasions. India continues to rely mostly on coal and oil despite making a number of bold climate promises. Consumption is predicted to rise in tandem with population expansion and industrialization. The Indian government has requested cooperation from development banks and high-income nations to move away from fossil fuels and toward renewable alternatives by investing in its green energy industry in accordance with the national strategy, during a number of climate summits in recent years. The government of India is dedicated to providing affordable energy to its citizens in order to bolster the national economy, despite the fact that there hasn't been enough foreign investment in the country's renewable energy sector thus far. India has come under fire for keeping up its purchases of Russian energy despite US and EU sanctions. But since it is keeping global oil prices low, India's Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Singh Puri, thinks the world is happy that it is purchasing its oil from Russia rather than from other sources, like the Middle East. Currently, almost 35% of India's oil imports come from Russian crude. This has assisted in lowering India's imports of oil from the Middle East. Sanctions on Russian energy products were imposed with the goal of severely undermining Moscow's ability to fund its war endeavors in Ukraine by drastically reducing its oil and gas income. Nonetheless, profits have stayed strong as long as China and India keep making significant investments in Russian energy. India purchased $37 billion worth of crude oil from Russia in 2023, a 13-fold increase in oil imports from the Russian Federation before the conflict. As key partners, the US and India are concerned about this. Sales of Russian crude to India are legal because they are not covered by sanctions. Nonetheless, it is believed that a substantial portion of Russia's oil, worth over $1 billion, was still refined in India before being shipped to the US. China has spent about $60 billion on Russian energy imports since the start of the conflict. A variety of Russian energy items have been imported by China at a reduced price, as Moscow looked to forge new trading relationships in the face of the severe sanctions imposed by its current importers. China has benefited from cheap energy imports from Russia. The country's energy bill has decreased by an estimated $18 billion as a result of oil discounts. While several nations have changed the way they trade energy in order to become less dependent on Russian energy goods, other nations have strengthened their connections with Moscow in order to take advantage of the lower energy costs that Russia is providing. This has lowered energy costs and guaranteed supplies for nations like China and India. Due to India's decrease in Middle Eastern oil imports, it has also resulted in a drop in oil prices. This has significantly impacted Russia's oil earnings and severely weakened the US and EU sanctions measures, bolstering Russia's military endeavors in the process. The largest state-owned refiners in India have seen a decline in refining margins in recent months as a result of increased difficulty obtaining Russian oil and rising freight costs as a result of the disruption of crude shipments over the Red Sea, experts and traders tell Bloomberg. For the majority of 2023, Indian refiners profited greatly from strong refining margins due to the importation of inexpensive Russian oil at $20 per barrel or less than international benchmarks. Although they are still larger than they were prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted global crude trade flows, margins began to erode last quarter. The fall in refining margins can be attributed to greater expenses for Indian refiners as a result of increased rivalry for Russian supplies in Asia, higher freight costs, and stricter enforcement of U.S. sanctions, which have restricted India's access to extremely cheap Russian crude. According to Mukesh Sadev, head of oil trade and downstream research at Rystad Energy, India may lose its advantage in refining if it is unable to secure cheaper crude from Russia, as reported by Bloomberg. India's purchases of crude and imports of Russian oil have been impacted in recent weeks by the tightening implementation of sanctions, the reduction of Russian grade discounts, and the increase in freight charges brought on by the dangers to shipping in the Red Sea. A sizable portion of the tanker fleet used to transport Russian crude overseas has been rendered obsolete by the United States' stricter implementation of sanctions. Half of the 50 ships that the U.S. Department of Treasury hit with penalties for violating sanctions have not loaded cargo since October, according to a Bloomberg article. The article did point out that since the fines for sanction violations are being applied in batches and won't impact every vessel on the list at once, this may not be the whole story. In fact, according to Bloomberg, 18 of the 50 vessels that the Department of Treasury designated in October of last year have since loaded cargo. 9 of them were shuttle tankers, and the remaining ones, despite being added to the list, were still making regular flights. According to Bloomberg, of the remaining 31, 7 were idle prior to the Treasury's list release, and 3 were scheduled to load a cargo shortly. According to Eric Van Nostrand, Treasury's acting Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, independent agencies, market analysts, and the Russians themselves point to the fact that the price cap is achieving both of our goals, simultaneously promoting stable energy markets and denying Russia the energy profits it needs to wage its illegal war. In 2022, the United States and its G7 allies set a price ceiling on Russian oil with the goal of lowering the country's oil export earnings while preventing a crude shortfall. Russia swiftly said at the moment that it would not be selling at the capped pricing, and the cap was established at $60 per barrel. As luck would have it, the price cap was maintained for the most of the year and into 2023 for Russia's flagship Urals mix, allowing both parties to declare success. Then, with many barrels of oil selling for far more than the price cap, both oil and Russian oil prices increased. What are your thoughts on Russia, China and India? Let me know down below. If you want to continue to learn about business investing and financial education, we have got this video waiting on the screen for you to check out. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.